Hello, everyone. Welcome to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African Talks, also known as SIKA Talks. I'm Sika, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. This episode is dedicated to introducing the podcast for this first installment and giving you a better understanding of what SIKA Talks is, why it was created, and its objectives. The podcast is dedicated to the analysis and discussion of critical topics related to development and politics on the African continent only. In our already recorded episodes, we've covered themes related to development such as economic aspects, climate change, and the environment. This topic allows us, to explore questions of Africa's development in general, as well as focus on individual countries with significant potential or notable progress. So, in a nutshell, SIKA Talks is a podcast, centered on all matters concerning the development of the continent, always from the perspective of promoting sustainable growth. If you're wondering why the podcast is not talking about other international development issues happening on other countries or other continent, outside the African continent, well, the answer is pretty simple. It's not actually to say that what's happening, outside Africa does not matter, but I think the reason why I decided personally to take that road and create an African-centered podcast is simply because of all the under-representativeness, when it comes to news at the international level discussing issues in Africa. That's the first reason. The second reason is also because, unfortunately, the African continent is the least developed in the world. And I personally believe that as a young person and as a young African, my personal contribution could be to dedicate and focus on addressing the most relevant and the most critical issues, development issues and political issues taking place on the continent, and also raising the awareness among young African intellectuals like myself, but also among people who share a profound passion for African development and political stability. So, to answer the next logical question as to why SIKA Talks, well, first of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Sika, and I'm a young person of Ivorian origin. I was born and raised, in Côte d'Ivoire, where I spent the first 20 years of my life. So after that, I got the privilege, to start traveling and to also expatriate myself in South Africa to start studying at a tertiary level, but also to start an international career in development finance and business law. Through my journey, I realized the immense potential, Africa holds, but there's also a significant issue among young people, particularly. The first issue that I noticed and that actually led me to create SIKA Talks, and that will also help me understand the question of why SIKA Talks, is because of a profound lack of interest among the youth with regard to politics and development issues around the African continent. And this is my personal analysis. This lack of interest is understandable given that political transition in some African countries have historically been mishandled, creating skepticism among both young people and also adults. I believe that for someone from the 90s generation like myself, I recognize that Africa, is one of the most populous continents with one of the highest population growth rates globally. Over 40% of Africa's population, is under the age of 35. To some extent, I'd say 40. When we look at African politics, unfortunately, it's impossible to extract, the same trend. The average age of people in power in politics on the continent is between 60 and 70 years old. While obviously, elders play a critical role in progress, preparing for transition is very essential because development isn't just about infrastructure. Development, it's about human capital. The only way, for the African continent to have a skilled and a well-trained human capital is by also teaching, the youth to learn and to engage at a very early stage when it comes to political debate and political concerns, but also development contribution, development concern. I think it's very important. So now that we all understand the why around the creation of this podcast, this amazing, development and political podcast, the next question I would like to try and understand is regarding the mission, of this podcast, the mission of S.I.K.A Talks. Well, S.I.K.A Talks is also about rekindling, the love for development and political discourse among young Africans. This is very pertinent personally. Whether you are Ivorian or Malian or South African, Moroccan or Tanzanian, S.I.K.A Talks, seeks to make political discussions engaging, interactive, and accessible to everyone. Just as easily as we might debate a Real Madrid versus Barcelona match, we should also be able, as young intellectual African and young African in general, to discuss pressing development and political issues around education, transport, renewable energy, entrepreneurship, political climates, and so on and so forth. To me, it's very important. It should come naturally. It should also be training among African, we should create a general trend where, debating and discussing the most pressing issues with regard to development and political stability will be very important and very fun also and very entertaining as much as debating or discussing the next Burna Boy concert or the next S.I.K.A concert or the next S.I.K.A concert in South Africa. Entertainment is very interesting. It's also important because you cannot be serious all the time. But I also personally think that as we are currently in Africa, it's very important and very critical for our generation, starting from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and upward, to also become very involved, in the most serious topics. Now that you know the missions of S.I.K.A Talks, I have a very interesting question that's popping in my mind, and this is a valid question. There are numerous podcasts out there, and definitely what I'm trying to say here is not to discourage you or to prohibit you from listening to other podcasts. I personally do encourage you to listen to as much podcast as you want. I myself, I'm a big fan of podcasts. I enjoy development podcasts. I enjoy social life podcasts. I enjoy business podcasts. Depending on my mood, I enjoy a specific category of podcasts. But as I'm promoting and as I'm also presenting S.I.K.A Talk to you, I think it's very important that I highlight what sets my podcast apart. And the first element is that it's created by young people for young people. This is very important. Like I said, one of my key objectives here with S.I.K.A Talks is to make political and development debate fun, relevant, entertaining, and trending among young African in general, but among young intellectual in particular. So that's the first, benefit and the first element, in my opinion, that actually sets my podcast apart from other podcasts. Another very interesting element is that it's rooted in intellect, passion, and authenticity, and also youthfulness. Unlike other podcasts, S.I.K.A Talks does not focus on celebrity guests. But instead, I personally enjoy inviting, the best and brightest young minds passionate about Africa's development. That's actually what set the podcast apart. So if you're looking for celebrities host here, perhaps we might be lucky, to secure some celebrities here within the development and the political landscape. But overall, the critical idea is not to have or to invite, head of states or central banker or public figures. But the idea is to actually voice up the concerns, of young Africans and to also share our powerful perspectives to the latest development and political issues. So, for example, in season 1, which actually occurred from 2023 up to the end of 2024, we hosted Kioma, and Kioma is of South African and Nigerian origin. And we discussed, international trade and strategies for better resource management in Africa. I also welcome Germinal, an Ivorian intellectual who analyzed the impact of the newly formed alliance of Sahel states on West Africa's, political and economic stability. So, as I was saying, these guests may not be globally famous, but they are superstars in their fields because, first of all, they are young, they are very smart and bright. They are also passionate, knowledgeable, and deeply committed, to discussing Africa's development and to also contributing with their most, innovative and groundbreaking solution. And I personally that this is very, very important. So the next aspect I want to focus on in this presentation is to also point out at another goal of SIKA Talks, which is, again, and also to reshape perception about African youth. Like I said, it's very important to also present a new face when it comes to African youth. Like, we are not just famous for our sport talent or entertainment talent, but the continent also has the brightest mind and the brightest talent when it comes to development into political landscape. We can clearly think of President Diomaye Faye in Senegal and Ousmane Sonko, who amazingly, changed the status quo in Senegal. And I think this is doable, in the rest of Africa. Perhaps the approach can be different, but the end result is to have and to see more young African intellectuals at the affairs of the African continent and their continent. So it's very important to also change the reality, change stereotypes, often, portraying young African and young people as more focused on entertainment. This is not true. And this podcast is also about showcasing their brilliance and proving that, African youth are capable of critical thinking, reasoning, and contributing meaningfully to development. This is very important in my opinion. So this is almost the conclusion, definitely the conclusion. I think I'm thrilled to announce you the launch of season 2 of SIKA Talks, which is starting, in January, the 1st of January 2025. This new season will feature even more fascinating episodes, thought-provoking discussions, and diverse guests, from seasoned experts to young professionals with innovative perspectives. So thank you very much, for your support and for growing this community with me. It's impossible. I cannot do it, without you. I cannot do it alone. I'm definitely counting on your support. And again, thank you for your current support. Whether you're in Francophone, Anglophone, or Lusophone Africa, this podcast is for all young Africans and people who are passionate about development. So do not forget to share this episode, to leave a like and to also follow me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and now on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Let's continue to challenge, preconceived ideas with powerful perspectives. Thank you.